This morning, we're going to take a look at this story from 2 Kings 5, and I love that because the books of 1st and 2nd Kings are so interesting. In fact, I think last year we took a pretty long look at 1st Kings. And these books are so interesting because they're full of these stories of these two divided but somehow yet one great kingdom. They have a lot of wild events, so it has this kind of mystical feel about it sometimes when you read certain texts. And of course, it would be kind of silly for these two books to be called Kings if it didn't have something to do about kings. So throughout both of these books, you have all of these kings. Some good, mostly bad. And the aftermath that comes from a king who is either faithful and worships the one true God of Israel, or adopts the gods of their neighbors and implements idolatry within Israel and Judah. And one thing that seems to run throughout both of these books is the idea that the people of God seem to always be at war. And that kind of seems to be what happens when you have shaky leadership. And leadership that directly goes against God's standards for his people and their kings. So over and over again you read, Israel is fighting against the Edomites or the Moabites. So many of these smaller nation groups that will eventually lead into these great powers coming and being used as tools of God's judgment when he says enough is enough. What we read today goes hand in hand with those themes. But the setting is different, though. Again, Israel is having interactions with one of their neighboring nations, but this time it isn't about war, at least in this chapter. It isn't about fighting. In fact, the beginning of the reading introduces the first character to us. And we read that there is a man named Naaman, who is highly regarded as the leader of the army of Aram. He's a skilled and accomplished fighter. He's highly regarded by his masters. We can imagine it's something like a right-hand man to the king. And despite all of these accolades and accomplishments, though, if you notice in the reading, all is not perfect in Naaman's life, though. We read that despite being this accomplished, valiant, tough warrior, he also had leprosy. Now, when I think of leprosy, I imagine someone dealing with this kind of broad description of some kind of disease, and they're forced to live as outcasts in society because you don't want others to get sick either. We see this sort of guideline established in Leviticus 13 or 14, where if you have a skin disease like this, you can't worship in the temple like everyone else, so you need to make special arrangements in that case. Likewise, throughout our Christian church history, we read of people like St. Francis, who goes to these places where people are living as outcasts with leprosy, and they love and they minister to them. So it supports this idea that typically when someone is dealing with leprosy, it would separate them from interaction with other people. This does not, however, seem to be the case with Naaman. We read that he has leprosy, but it seems as though, all things considered, he's living quite well. He has done well for himself. He's in a higher position than just the regular Joe Schmo. And we don't at least read that Naaman is actively looking for any sort of cure. He's just kind of living with this. It isn't until Naaman and his army capture a girl from Israel that this changes. He brings in this girl from Israel to work as a servant to his wife, and this brave girl is the first one who mentions, at least that we see in this text, a cure for Naaman's disease. And I say that this girl is brave, but imagine just how much that is true. Because not only is a slave speaking up to their master, but she's an ordinary girl speaking to this man who leads an army fighting against her own people. And she explains to Naaman that in Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, there is healing for this disease. So for the very first time, at least, that we know, healing is offered for this disease that Naaman is suffering from. He isn't out looking for it, that we know. But we do know that in this moment, he is being offered it. So the king of Aram sends Naaman to the king of Israel with a letter and some gifts, and expects that if there is in fact healing for this leprosy in Israel, the king will heal the leader of his army. But when Naaman arrives, though, letter in hand and some gold and some silver, that really doesn't do the trick to smooth things over. The king of Israel sees Naaman coming, and he rips his clothes off and says, "Am I God that I can kill and bring back to life?" The king of Aram must be trying to start a fight with me, start a quarrel. The king of Israel is way over his head. I mentioned before that throughout the book of Kings, Israel is almost continually at war with one of the nations around them. Well, this nation, Aram, is one of them. The very king who is sending Naaman to Israel has fought against the people he hopes will heal his general. Naaman himself probably fought and killed people from Israel. In fact, at the end of 1 Kings, we read that the army of Aram even killed the king of Israel himself. Now, granted, God said that the evil king Ahab would die. But imagine someone coming to your doorstep when you're the king of Israel and you're asked to help this guy who has a history of killing kings. There's this documentary out on, I think, Netflix and a bunch of different places. It was popular a few years ago. And it's about orcas, the killer whales that live at SeaWorld. And it's called Blackfish. And the most famous orca of the bunch that lives in SeaWorld was named Tilikum. And Tilikum had a history of being violent and angry because for his whole life he lived in this little tiny tank. So he was angry, he was violent. And he eventually killed a number of trainers that worked with him. Now imagine this orca's history and then the manager at SeaWorld telling you, "Okay, you're the next trainer." I imagine that is how the king of Israel feels. And even as early as the next chapter, we see Israel fighting with Aram once again. It's also important to note that during this time, something else is happening in Israel's history. They still have kings. We see that here, but we also see the rise of the prophet in society. The ones that we know mediate this message from God to his people. And these prophets are starting to rise in power in Israel's society. They still have kings, but the kings almost always fail. And it's left to the prophet to give this revelation from God to save the day, to deliver his people, to say, this is how we turn it around. So we see the prophet elevated in society alongside the king. And knowing that the king is over his head, the prophet Elisha, who we read last week, is rising up as the prophet, as Elijah is taken up into heaven, steps in and knows what to do. Elisha has a very easy set of instructions to do if Naaman wants to be healed. All you have to do, take a bath 7 times in the Jordan River. I remember having chickenpox as a kid, and I had to take oatmeal baths for 2 weeks. Simple. This is easy. Unfortunately, though, Naaman doesn't exactly see it that way, does he? He says, "You're a prophet. I thought you would just wave your hands over me and I would be healed. I don't want to wash in the dirty Jordan River. We have all these rivers where I'm from. They're much better, much cleaner. Can't I just go home and take a bath in those waters?" But after a little coaxing and a little explanation that no, this is what Naaman has to do, he finally listens to Elisha and dips himself in the Jordan 7 times, and lo and behold, Naaman is healed. Healed completely. He has the skin of a boy, it says. But the true miracle of this story is not that Naaman's skin is healed. The miraculous part of this story is that once this man receives God's grace, when the sovereign Lord acts toward him in mercy, what's his response? "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. Give me just a small chunk of land to go back and make burnt offerings when I'm here, because your servant will never make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other God again but the Lord." The miracle is that it is the great God of Israel healed Naaman from this disease, but he also changed his heart. God can change the state of Naaman's skin, this disease that he's been living with, and that's great, but to change a heart that is made of stone to a heart of flesh, now that's something. For us, I think this reading has a lot to say to us about how we view and deal with those that we consider enemies. Because let's be clear, that is exactly what Naaman was to the people of Israel. They are not friends. On the one hand, you have Naaman, who is completely shutting out the wisdom of the people he would consider enemies. And it isn't until he listens to some of them that he is ever healed. So you have on the one hand, you might read this and think, even if someone is considered an enemy, maybe there is value in listening to them. And on the other hand, we read about a God whose grace that is extended even to the enemy. And not only that, but this grace is extended by a slave girl to her master. The grace of God being so powerful, so wonderful, that it even extends to those that we might consider enemies. In fact, it's so wonderful, it's so powerful, it's so based in the love of God that it even extends to you and me when we were once enemies to God. When we were lost and in love with our sin. God's grace spoke to rebels even then. I think a reading like this is useful for a time like today, and even for a day like the 4th of July. I mean, you take super current events and life-changing events like the overturning of Roe, or Roe being overturned, and you see protests on both sides, not just in Washington, D.C., you can see it in Washington, PA. And it's really easy in the midst of something like that to say that the person on the other side of the street holding signs is my enemy, and I certainly want nothing to do with them. And regardless of where you fall on that, even though I personally think that the scriptures are quite clear on the value of life made in the image of God, does that make that other person our enemy? No. Certainly not necessarily. And then even if it did, well, what does it mean then for us? Well, Matthew 5 makes it quite clear. You love your enemies. You love them. And the reading for today from 2 Kings teaches us that God extends his grace to them. That his people point others to this fount of grace and mercy, even those they consider their enemy. We've gotten so tangled up in these other things lately, where we take these different things about us and we tie them so closely to our identity that this is who we are, that we often lose sight of who we are as Christ's people. We've often pushed this idea to love our enemies to the side. It's something we talk about. You might say, yeah, we do that, but do we actively and often love our enemies? How does an understanding like this, knowing that God calls his enemies to himself, change the way we celebrate the 4th of July? Is it that all of us in America versus and better and set apart and isolated from everyone else in the world? I don't think so. God does some awesome things, but changing the heart of the enemy, the rebel, the runaway, the prodigal son, extending grace to them, and then changing their hearts, that's incredible. And as God's people, being continually conformed and shaped into the image of the Son, we are called into this awesome work of extending grace and love as well. Amen.